Vamos ter uma nova sessão no âmbito da cadeira de debates contemporâneos sobre teoria e política económica do doutoramento em Economia. Quero agradecer ao nosso convidado de hoje, muito em particular, portanto, o professor Vítor Neves, que vem da Faculdade de Economia da Universidade de Coimbra e que é também investigador do Centro de Estudos Sociais. E quero ainda agradecer ao público aqui presente e muito em particular ao apoio que o DINÂMIA'CET tem dado à organização destes seminários e em particular na pessoa da Maria José e do Bruno Vasconcelos, que têm prestado apoio a toda esta organização. Só uma pequena nota de entrada, portanto, o objetivo destes seminários tem sido de realçar a natureza plural da economia e, portanto, de dar aqui lugar, espaço à controvérsia das ideias económicas e também das políticas. Nós ainda vamos ter mais uma outra sessão, será uma sessão no dia 5 de maio sobre questões de financiarização com o professor Ricardo Mamed, que está aqui à nossa frente. Só mais uma nota, portanto o seminário vai decorrer em inglês, embora maioritariamente a sala seja composta por pessoas que falam e percebem o português, mas essa é uma regra do doutoramento de Economia. No entanto, no debate o que nós temos feito é as pessoas podem colocar questões em português ou em inglês, conforme se sentirem mais confortáveis. Bem, welcome to this seminar named The Problem of Social Costs and present by Professor Vítor Neves. The presentation will be in English, however, in the debate you can put your questions and make your comments in both language, Portuguese and English. So, thank you.
Então, se me permitem, eu começo também em português. Começo por cumprimentar os presentes, agradecer a vossa presença e queria naturalmente agradecer ao ISCTE, à organização deste programa de doutoramento e em particular à professora Ana Costa, que teve a amabilidade de me convidar. É um prazer enorme estar aqui. Como ela disse, eu sou professor na Faculdade de Economia da Universidade de Coimbra e habituei-me ao longo dos anos a considerar o ISCTE uma escola de referência, uma escola inovadora e, portanto, para mim é um grande prazer estar aqui hoje. E o tema que vos trago é precisamente o tema que me tem ocupado nos últimos tempos, já há alguns anos, o problema dos custos sociais. Frequentemente entendido como o problema das externalidades. Mas vão ver ao longo da sessão porque é que eu prefiro chamar-lhe o problema dos custos sociais. Bom, e como me disseram que a sessão tem que ser em inglês, então eu passo para a sessão em inglês. The subject, the topic of my conversation with you today is the problem of social costs. What I intend to do is, first of all, put the question of why revisiting the literature on social costs, or, if you will, externalities. As I don't know how familiar or acquainted you are with this subject, I will provide you a brief, very short refresh on the conventional approach on externalities, and then I will proceed with different stories about this subject. I will make a brief reference to PIGU, but then most of the time I will discuss COES and someone I suppose you might not have heard about. The name is Carl William Kapp, an unknown but a very important unknown economist. And after this, the question will be why the relative neglect of Kapp's work. And that will be my last point of this talk. So let me start with why revisit this topic. And the basic reason is that, in my view, the current discourse on social costs and externalities is both incomplete and partial. Paolo Ramazzotti, an Italian, made a very good point on what is the situation at the time on social cost. And I quote, "The notion of social cost is still open to debate. Different theoretical approaches tend to look at the issue in different ways, and this would not be a problem if it testified to the liveliness of economic thought and debate. Unfortunately," says Ramazzotti, "this is not the case. The variety of treatments of the social cost issue reflects the neglect of some approaches, thus the persistence of open issues. It is somewhat daunting." In another version, he talked about, he used the word surprising. It is somewhat daunting that Kapp's work should be ignored by well-known scholars, despite his important contribution to this topic. I fully agree with this. That is, the subject is still open, not because we have a lively debate, but because we have neglected some very important issues on this. The usual approaches students of economics are exposed to are the Pigovian and the Coesian traditions. These are the dominant approaches to social cost analysis, studied in terms of negative externalities. However, there are two important points I would like to call your attention to. The first one is that I said Pigovian and Coesian traditions. I didn't say Pigou and Coes, because I think they are different. And the other point I want to raise your interest on this is that Kapp elaborated, as I said before, a completely neglected approach, and this work constitutes today what Sebastian Berger classified as a distinct and clearly distinguishable institutional argument on social costs. That is, we have perhaps still a little bit unelaborated approach, institutional approach to social costs, which is ignored in economics courses. The truth, however, is that, as Beckerman, an environmental economist, acknowledged in 1972, CAP should be credited for having been the first to draw our attention to the widespread nature of external costs imposed by many productive activities and the way in which this impaired the environment. So, I think we should revisit this topic. And my argument will be that we should revisit the classics. And when I say classics, I'm saying the work of Pigou, Arthur Pigou, the work of Ronald Coase, and the work of CAP himself. Pigou wrote The Economics of Welfare in 1920. The Coase is famous and very well known by his work on the problem of social cost, the paper he published in 1960. And Carl William Kapp wrote an entire book on the social costs of private enterprise in 1950. He published a second and revised edition in 1963 in which he changed the title of the book. Instead of social costs of private enterprise, he called it the social costs of business enterprise. And there are reasons for this change. We'll see this later on. My point is this. Let's look at the classics again. A brief refresh on the discussion of externalities. Usually students of economics, for instance in courses of economics of the public sector or public economics, are exposed to the subject of externalities, and students are told that we are talking about a problem which arises in the economy as a result of a divergence between private and social costs, or between private and social benefits, which is caused by those actions of individuals and business firms which have either harmful effects or positive effects on others in a way that is outside the market mechanism. And this is the basic problem. That is, this divergence does not give place to a demand or an offer of a compensation. In other words, we have a divergence between private and social costs or benefits which is not translated in terms of market prices. Externalities are usually understood as secondary side effects associated to principal activity. That is, usually if we think in terms of social costs or negative externalities are seen as undesirable secondary effects of a principal activity. That is, in the economy we are producing goods which are seen as important for the economy, but as a side effect we have harmful problems related to this which have no translation in terms of market prices. And students are usually told that this problem externalities can be produced by people or firms, that is by consumers, individual agents, or productive firms. They can be positive or negative, and as the basic problem is the one of not being translated in terms of market prices, we distinguish external effects which are outside of the market mechanism, and we call them real externalities, and we distinguish these real externalities from those which, although being external effects, they are translated in terms of market prices, and we call them pecuniary externalities, which in fact are not, in the conventional literature, seen as real externalities. Basically, what we have is that if we leave the market to work unconstrained, we will have a private optimum defined at the point where marginal private costs and marginal benefits are equal. So we have this level here of production, Q1, which is or corresponds to a private optimum, and we are told that this is because firms ignore this marginal damage, which, if taken into account, would lead to adding this marginal damage to the marginal private cost, produce a marginal social cost, which in fact would give us the social efficient level of production at this level here. That is, Q star would be the socially efficient level of production. So the problem of social costs would be a problem of inefficiency related with an excessive level of production. If needed, I will go back to this point here, but I think it's more productive to go over these details of something I suppose you are acquainted with, and we'll proceed with giving you what I think is the picture of a conventional course in public economics on this particular topic, externalities. After showing students that we have here a problem of producing too much, and showing that this problem could be solved by some way if we could lead the market level of production to the socially efficient level of production, the basic point of discussion becomes what are the solutions. And students are usually told that we have three different types of solutions to the problem of externalities. A public type of solutions, that is intervention made by the government, usually through government regulations and the famous Pigovian tax. And then students are told that Coase, with his Coase theorem, has shown that government is not needed, and that we could solve the problem of externalities based on market forces, on private bargaining, and so we wouldn't need the government. Then we present a third kind of solutions, which is the so-called mixed solution. The basic example is the cap-and-trade system. For instance, in Europe, the European emissions trading system on CO2. And so the discussion becomes mostly a discussion on different recommendations for government action. The discussion is basically more or less governments in this subject. And what I want to show you now is that there are other neglected stories on this. The first one, I will not go into detail on this, but I would say just the following. The Pigouvian story is not completely fair with Pigou, because Pigou is more sophisticated than the textbooks of economics say about the Pigouvian approach. For instance, there is a text, a very unknown text from Arthur Pigou called, entitled State Action and Laissez-faire, published in 1935, in which Pigou distinguishes what is an approach, an abstract theoretical approach, from one which goes into the details of practice and public action. And it becomes more careful, I would say, in terms of the discussion of public intervention in this text. But as I said, I will not go into detail on this. I would refer you to the last book of Medema, Stephen Medema, I suppose 2012, called The Excitant Hand. And there is an article, a journal paper, by, as I don't know how to pronounce his name, Aslam Begi and Medema, from 1998. So let me go directly to the discussion on cause and CAP. Cause is my second story. And my second story to say that what we find in Cause's works is not just a statement on the undesirableness of public action in the economy. What we find in Cause is what Medema called a new paradigm of analysis. Cause changed the problem, changed the way we look at the problem of externalities. It didn't like the label externality, precisely because when it changed the way economists used to look at externalities, in reality, we do not have externalities, that is, external effects, because in his approach, we have a reciprocal relationship. I will quote on Cause from his paper of 1960, in which he says, the question is commonly thought of as one in which A inflicts harm on B, and what has to be decided is how should we restrain A. But this is wrong. We are dealing with the problem of a reciprocal nature. To avoid the harm to B would inflict harm on A. The real question that has to be decided, says Cause, is should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? And the problem, says Cause, is to avoid the more serious harm. According to Cause, the problem has not its origin, as usually thought before his work, has not its origin in an agent A unilaterally imposing harm on another agent. So we don't have an offender-victim kind of situation, but we have a situation in which both parties are involved in the problem. That is, as he says, both parties cause the damage. So the problem for cause is that in the economy we have different agents with different interests, and these interests go into conflict. And he says both A and B have a set of interests, and the real issue is to decide whether A should be allowed to harm B or B allowed to harm A. That is, it's a problem of assignment of rights. That is, the problem is who is going to have his interests translated into legal rights. And his answer to the problem is always avoid the more serious harm. In his view, assigning a right to one party entails exposing others to the effects of the exercise of that right, and so costs run in both directions and not from agent A, the offender, to agent B, the victim. Let me quote another phrase we find in his paper. The cost of exercising a right is always the loss which is suffered elsewhere in a consequence of the exercise of that right. The inability to cross land, to park a car, to build a house, to enjoy a view, to have peace and quiet, or to breathe clean air. So you see, what's the approach here? Everybody involved in the externality is responsible for that externality. And of course, this raises some problems we may discuss. What I want to give you notice of the change of approach from Pigou and the Pigouvians generally to cause is that in the conventional previous approach, we had externalities as a market failure. Now we are seeing the problem understood in a completely different way. It's not a market failure, but a conflict of rights. And if it's a conflict of rights, if it's a failure to assign property rights, it's basically a problem of government failure. So the way Coase puts the problem changed completely its nature. So the problem becomes who is going to be protected by the law and the courts and be given the status of rights. And after making this change of perspective, Coase says the problem is basically a problem of calculation. We have to compute the value, the costs involved in the different kinds of action, in the different courses of action involved in an externality. He says the problem is just one of choosing the course of action which on balance brings the greatest good or the least harm. And one of the more interesting statements of Coase on this topic is when he says that the problem is certainly a difficult problem, but no more difficult than all the other problems involving economic calculation. He says it's a difficult and important question, but certainly just, and I underline, just a question of valuation. And so the decision rule for Coase is to choose the situation which maximizes the total value of the output. A problem of calculation in the end. The truth is that usually students of economics are not exposed to this change of perspective. The question is just one discussion about policy measures, about role of government in the solution of the externality problem. And usually, and my experience says that, and I never understood, because after taking some time telling my students in the second year of public economics about Coase, in the end, what I see in the exams is that the basic message they get is that the Coase theorem assures that the government is not needed because private bargaining solves the problem. I can't understand why. But what I know is that perhaps this comes from what they see in the textbooks. Because in the textbooks, usually we see the exposition of the no transaction costs case. Transaction costs are, appear sometimes as significant, but they are not given the relevance I think they should have. And in fact, if you go to the 1960 paper of Ronald Coase, you see that the first 15 or 16 pages deal with the no transaction costs case. But after that, and until page 44, I suppose the text has 44 pages, we are dealing all the time with transaction costs positive transaction costs. And in the case of zero transaction costs, we all know, I suppose, if transaction costs are zero, the problem of externalities could only occur due to a failure to assign property rights. If they were assigned, the market would be able to generate an efficient solution, and amazingly, this would be independent from the initial assignment of rights. So it's the most elegant aspect of the Coase theorem, is showing that it doesn't matter if the law gives the property rights, assigns property rights to one party or to the other, because in the end, the market solves the problem. But, let me go over this. But what Coase believes, in his own words, was his main contribution, was the discussion of the positive transaction costs case. He says, usually economists refer to my work as the world of Coase dealing with zero transaction costs, but in fact my world, the world of COES, is the world of positive transaction costs. And if that is the case, COES shows that private bargaining will not solve the problem. The legal system and the institutional structure of the economy will influence the allocation of resources and the working of the economic system. So the basic message we get from COES is not the COES theorem, but the idea that the law is a significant aspect, and the institutional structure of the economy generally are basic aspects of the discussion on efficiency and efficient allocation of resources. COES doubts that we can find an optimal solution. He was very suspicious of what he called blackboard economics, and he proposed instead that we undertook a comparative institutional approach. That is, instead of comparing an ideal situation and a real situation, we should look at two different real situations and compare them and do empirical work in order to see what was the most advantageous one. That is, what would involve the least costs. So, my point is that instead of seeing in the discussion on COES-PIGU a discussion on the role of government, we should first of all see two different approaches to this problem: market failure or a lack of conditions for markets to work as COES thought. And now the third story, the one I like more to discuss, which is the story I called the missing actor. In economics, in economics textbooks, we discuss COES, we discuss PIGU, we discuss the case of the cap-and-trade system, but usually we don't know who was this man. Carl Wilhelm Kapp was a German-born economist. He emigrated first to Switzerland in the 30s, running away from the Nazi regime, and he made his PhD in Geneva, and then he got a scholarship and went to the United States, where he stayed for about 30 years. And it was in the United States that he discussed, or he elaborated his theory on social costs. Actually, Kapp is a leading institutional economist. He had lots of exchange correspondence with Myrdal, and he was involved in a project of building an international association of institutional economists, basically in Europe. At the same time as I forgot the name of the evolutionary association, it's not the name, the American one, the Association for Evolutionary Economics. Is that good? The Association for Evolutionary Economics, they had some divergence. So we are talking about someone who was important, and his PhD was about international trade and economic planning. And in this context, he raised in a footnote the problem of social costs as a problem of economic calculation, and he was involved in an old discussion with the Austrian economists like Mises and later with Hayek. In 1950, as I told you, he published Social Costs of Private Enterprise. This was just the first of many works he wrote on social costs until his death. For CAP, the problem seems to be almost the same as for the conventional approach. That is, we are dealing with a significant range of harmful consequences and damage to the economy brought about by productive activities and business practices. It talks about a variety of these economies, increased risks and uncertainties, which may extend far into the future, which are not accounted for in entrepreneurial outlays, but instead are shifted to and borne by third persons and the community as a whole. It seems more or less identical to the previous definition. In fact, it's not, because we are not talking about externalities as a problem that can be raised by individuals as consumers. We are focused on just productive activities and business practices. And instead of the usual approach until a few years ago, which tended to see externalities as an extraordinary, occasional problem, for CAP, the social costs problem is a widespread and inevitable phenomena under conditions of business enterprise, and linked to the intrinsic nature of the capitalism system. It says, by minimizing their internal costs, business enterprises tend to shift and actually maximize the social costs. That is, if we think a little bit, we see that it's in the intrinsic logic of capitalism to generate social costs. Because if the goal is to minimize costs, productive costs, it's logic that firms will tend to shift as much as they can costs to the overall economy and society. But of course, according to CAP, social costs were not unavoidable under all conditions. They depended upon the institutions and of the economy and could be minimized or even avoided by appropriate measures. There is a redistributive dimension of social costs, of course. I will jump over this. Instead of seeing the problem of social costs in the way we saw before with my graph, in which we are looking for an equilibrium solution, in this case, CAP understood, according to the evolutionary approach of institutional economists, as an evolutionary cumulative process in which the causal processes leading to social costs involve, as a rule, non-market, asymmetric and often involuntary relationships, that are imposed. I jumped here something. Who are imposed, we impose their interests upon the economically and politically weaker parts of society. That is, we are dealing with something that is different from the symmetric contractual relationship we saw in the case of COEs. In COEs, we have different interests Some are given the status of rights, others are not, and we have bargaining on these different interests. For CAP, the process leading to social costs is not this kind of problem. And again, I quote from one of his works in which he says, the process of environmental disruption, usually CAP discussed the problem of social costs linked with the problem of the environmental disruption. He is usually seen as an environmental or a forerunner of ecological economics. And he was discussing the process of environmental disruption and says, this process has nothing in common with the typical two persons market relationship. It is not the result of any voluntary contractual transaction. The affected persons are, as a rule, without protection. They have no voice in the matter. They are victims of a process over which they have little, if any, control. The degradation of the quality of the environment happens, so to speak, behind their backs, and the possibilities of redress are limited or ineffective under prevailing compensation laws. This is a point we may discuss later on if we have time, which is a reinterpretation of CAP made recently by Maurizio Franzini, which is very interesting because Franzini reads CAP and social costs in the CAPian perspective as something completely different from the usual approach based on the concept of Pareto efficiency. Social costs in CAP are violations of basic social rights, or even a reversal of these rights, which are perpetrated by market capitalism. And this independently of whether they occur in a Pareto efficient context or not. That is, as I put here, it is completely irrelevant whether the damage caused by the action of an agent are greater or lesser than the advantages they bring to those who produce them. Usually we tend to compare the gains and the costs, and costs are acceptable if the gains we get are greater than the losses imposed on some parts of society. And in this approach, if social costs are seen as violations of basic social rights, the social damage, even if less than the gains for companies, still represents a violation of social rights. This is a completely different perspective. And this helps us to understand why, for instance, Frank Knight criticized CAP because, in his view, CAP ignored the balancing of gains and costs. And he inclusively charged CAP of not doing economics, but socialist propaganda, as he said. So perhaps we can discuss this later on. Some while ago, I was intended to discuss this point. That is, differently from an approach based on the equilibrium concept, what we find in CAP's approach is the idea of social costs as the complex result of a combination of a plurality of factors, systemic relationships, which have a dynamic, self-reinforcing and cumulative character. So we cannot discuss social costs in CAP's approach using the usual concept of equilibrium. We have to go to another perspective based on an evolutionary approach. And this is another relevant point on CAP. It did not consider market prices as an appropriate indicator for the analysis of the most appropriate course of action. Because market prices, in his view, do not reflect the true relative importance of needs, and business costs calculated using market prices do not represent the true relative opportunity costs. So in his view, the valuation of social costs based on market prices and the usual monetary criteria such as the principle of willingness to pay or to accept a compensation based on market prices did not provide a sound basis for the evaluation of desirable course of action. He proposed instead that we build what he called a theory of social value. You might ask, what is that? He based on another institutional economist, John Morris Clark, who in a text published in 1936 says the following: the ultimate problems in which humanity is interested are not those of social value in the sense of value in society, that is, value expressed in market prices. What society is interested in is in the value of things to society. And this led CAP to argue in favor of building a completely different approach on valuation. He called a theory of social value. That is, a concept of value based upon what he called an objective, empirically ascertained criteria of what is necessary and essential for human life and survival. We are going further and further far away from the conventional approach. He proposed, in order to build this theory of social value, that economists and other social scholars worked on a theory of essential human needs. In his view, these social needs were bio-sociocultural needs, not the usual revealed preferences economists are used to talk about and think on. And he proposed that we worked on what he called the objectification of human needs, based on a concept of social use value. And he constructs some indicators based on what he called social minima criteria, or minimum adequate living conditions. And the counterpart of this, maximum tolerable levels of disruption. He linked this discussion to the concept of costs of life and human development. And he proposed that these minimum adequate living conditions were considered as the effective measuring rod we need for the definition of substantive aims and the actual progress made towards satisfying them. Of course, this would call for something more than using market prices. He proposed that we adopted a normative basic axiom for considering the analysis of social costs, which is the idea established as an axiom that human life, development, and survival are unquestioned aims which need no further proof or demonstration. This led CAP to work on and incentivize other scholars to work on the production of socio-ecological indicators and a comprehensive system of social accounts. Some progress has been made meanwhile on this task, building a comprehensive system of social accounts, although we are far away from what CAP had in mind. And finally, according to CAP's view, there is no hope of achieving technical solutions to the problem of externalities and social costs, because there is an inevitable element of collective deliberation and political discussion involved in all these social values we saw. So, judgment of the consequences and the implications of different ends following Dewey were seen as fundamental in his approach. So let me go to a quotation that I think synthesizes the way CAP saw the problem. He says, social costs and social benefits, he didn't exclude the positive externalities case from his analysis, although his focus has been mostly on social costs. Social costs and social benefits have to be considered as extra market phenomena. They are borne by and accrue to society as a whole. They are heterogeneous and cannot be compared quantitatively among themselves and with each other, not even in principle. We will have to look for other methods of assessment than those available or suggested in terms of market values. We will have to face political decisions based on evaluations arrived at outside the market and conditions of possible disagreement and lack of unanimous consent. This is a scheme I presented in other occasions, so I will jump over this. This was a scheme I made in order to make myself clear about CAP's approach. We can go, if you want, later on this. But now, because I want to have some spare time to discussion with you on this topic, I'm going to discuss as briefly as I can why students of economics and even economists usually don't know nothing about CAP's work. Although his important work on the environment and the linkage between environment and development, we can say CAP is an unknown among economists. Frank Knight, as I told you before, in 1951, wrote a review on Kapp's book, but he made the suggestion, as I said before, that this book was worse than other works Kapp had published before. And in fact, this was socialist propaganda, as I said. We find some brief references to Kapp's work in Calabresi in 1961, in James Buchanan in 1962, and we have a fierce discussion, two interesting papers I recommend to all of you to read by Wilfred Beckerman, and one from Beckerman and another from Kapp in the early 70s, I suppose in 1972. And these two papers are excellent because they show in a very impressive way the differences between the conventional approach, the neoclassical approach as exposed by Beckerman, and the reply produced by Kapp. Coase never said nothing, as far as I know, on Kapp. He completely ignored Kapp's work. Although, as I put here, Berger say that Kapp's work was well known at the time and translated into several languages. But the truth is that, amazingly, we don't find any explicit reference to Coase. It seems that Kapp ignored that Coase would be so relevant as we see Coase today. So my question is, why? And we will see why I want to discuss this point. Sebastian Berger, a friend of mine, we have worked together in the last few months. He has a view on this topic, which is, according to Berger, the lack of attention for Kapp's work was due to a deliberate pro-market, anti-interventionist ideological ignore strategy by Chicago School's neoliberal economists, like Stigler and Buchanan. And this, according to Berger, in order to change the discourse on social costs. That is, according to Sebastian Berger, the neglect of Kapp's work was intentional, was strategic in order to put institutional economists aside. I quote here Berger. He says, Coase's silence was probably not the result of an astonishing ignorance concerning well-known and widely accepted institutional arguments concerning social costs, but a conscious strategy of silence. In my view, this might have some importance in the discussion. But for me, the story has a different narrative. And the hypothesis I would like to submit to you is that the lack of attention to Kapp's work was above all due to the way they thought, due to their very contrasting approaches to the analysis of social costs. In the end, what I want to say is that Kapp was not seen by his fellow conventional economists as a true economist. He didn't think like an economist. or he was an outsider in the discussion of social costs. In my view, instead of a conscious strategy of silence, we have, it doesn't matter. Do not bother discuss with someone who is not one of ours. And that's the point I want to submit to you, because I think this is relevant for other discussions we have in economics. So in my reading, Coase and Pigou had very different views. But in spite of all their substantial differences, in the end, I believe they shared a similar neoclassically based analytical framework. When we compare Kapp and Coase and all the other conventional economists, followers of Coase, we see that we are talking about, I hope I made it more or less clear, they are talking about different theoretical problems, and these different theoretical problems are conceived within very different frames of mind. That is, Coase and Kapp have different worldviews, they have different conceptions on the nature and scope of economic analysis, and in the end, they have different ways of seeing the problem of social costs and how to deal with them. Why different theoretical problems? Because, in my view, in Coase and in Pigou, we are discussing what economists call an economic problem. Be it market failure, property rights failure, a transaction cost problem, it's an economic problem. We are discussing a problem with the basic tools of economists. Ultimately, we are using the Pareto framework to discuss efficiency. Neither Coase nor Pigou discussed the equity issue. They discussed externalities as an efficiency or inefficiency problem. In Kapp, we are dealing with what is saw as an intrinsic, systemic problem of capitalism, or as he tended to label capitalism, the system of business enterprise. So this is not the usual economic problem. It's broader than an economic problem. It's a political, it's a social, it's a collective problem. In the end, we are discussing how to solve the problem of social costs. And Kapp says we have to build a theory of social value, and this involves, in the end, a problem of collective deliberation and political discussion. So this is not the usual approach. Different frames of mind in terms of Coase talked about reciprocity. He analyzed the problem in terms of equilibrium. He emphasized property rights. He saw this as a problem of valuation which could be solved based on market prices, and in the end it was a technical issue. On the other hand, we see Kapp talking about different levels of power, more or less dominating units against unprotected people. Instead of equilibrium analysis, he proposed an approach based on the idea of cumulative causation. Instead of property rights, he discussed, as we saw, based on the reinterpretation of Franzini, the problem is a problem of violation of social rights. We cannot trust on market prices as an appropriate indicator for the discussion of social costs, because what we need is some sort of social valuation, and we are facing not a technical economic issue, but a societal, a political economy issue. So, intellectual exchange for what? Where Coase sees just a question of valuation, Kapp talked about a challenge to economics and its usual approaches. So my reading, as I said before, is that Kapp did not think like an economist. What I'm saying with this think like an economist is basically what is usually chapter 2 or 3 of any economics textbook we find in the first degree, in the first year of the first degree. The textbooks in economics, usually the chapter 2 or 3 is labeled thinking like an economist. And we learn to think like an economist. We are economists, we are not sociologists, we are not political scientists, because we have a different way of thinking. And Kapp seems not to think in this way. And I'm saying that is an outsider. Outsider, why? I'm using here the classification we find in Backhouse, Roger Backhouse, an historian and philosopher of economics. Backhouse, about dissent, classified several different levels of dissent, and one of them is what he called an extreme form of dissent. And this extreme form of dissent, being dissent, a disagreement somehow beyond the pale, that is, a disagreement which involves insiders and outsiders. And in these terms, there are some levels of dissent which do not give place to disagreement, to discussion, to controversy, because there are insiders and outsiders. So it's useless to become involved in controversies. And in my reading, the neglect of Kapp is because his approach was seen as somehow beyond the pale. And so we didn't need to engage in a discussion with Kapp. I have to explain why Kapp ignored Coase, but I didn't do that research so far. So, to conclude, I think we have time for discussion. First idea. The problem of social cost, as I said in the beginning, is still open to debate. It's incomplete and it's partial to restrain our attention to externalities, to just the Pigovian and the Coasean approach we usually study in economics courses. That is, in my view, there is here room for further research. There is lots of topics we should clarify in order to make this discourse on externalities and social costs more global. That is, if you want, as Sebastian Berger said, we need to bring to this discourse the institutional approach as well, and not just the conventional one. The second point I want to call your attention to is that we should revisit the classics. It has been my experience that whenever I go to the original texts, I find different characters, I find different approaches, and I find that what we studied as economics students usually is not completely the same as we find when we read the classics. And I'm talking about Coase, Pigou, Kapp, but I could talk about, for instance, Robbins, which was a very interesting case for me when I read Robbins for the first time, and I found that Robbins had, I would say, a few things in common with what I studied in the economics textbook. And the third and final question I would like to put to you is, after all, what are the limits of dialogue? Where lie the boundaries of pluralism in economics? Where are the limits? Where is the point beyond which there is no room for discussion, and some are good economists and the other are not economists or bad economists? Where is the limit? Where are the boundaries? We can be pluralists until what point, what level?